All right, here we go. Pleased to welcome you to the Masterclass series dedicated to warehouse technology excellence, brought to you by Kerber Supply Chain. I'm your host, Tom Goldsby. Today's session is titled From Production to Last Mile Delivery, WMS as the Integration Point. I'm pleased to be joined today by Mr. Jon Kuerschner of Kerber Supply Chain. Let's go ahead and get underway. Again, I'm Tom Goldsby. I come to you from the University of Tennessee in beautiful Knoxville, Tennessee. I serve as the Haslam Chair of Logistics, and also I serve as co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Business Logistics. Happy to be joined today by Jon Kuerschner. Jon is Vice President of Supply Chain Consulting for Kerber Supply Chain. Jon's been with High Jump and Kerber Supply Chain for nearly 15 years in a variety of capacities. Before becoming VP of Supply Chain Consulting 5 years ago, Jon had a variety of capacities. He also worked as a user as well with a major furniture retailer. So he's been on both sides of the equation as a user of technology and also a provider of technology and consultant in this space. So I'm going to turn things over to Jon in a few minutes, and we'll tap into his vast knowledge and expertise. But please allow me to go over a few items first and set the stage for today's session. So today is the fourth session in our Masterclass series dedicated to warehouse technology excellence. Perhaps some of you are joining us for the first time. So please allow me to explain why we're here. We're here to tackle the challenges of today's increasingly complex supply chain, bringing you best practices and innovative thinking from academics like myself, as well as industry insiders and senior leaders like Jon. What we're trying to accomplish is to provide guidance and insights in managing your supply chain as a competitive advantage, a strategic asset for your organization, an opportunity to excel, and ultimately to conquer supply chain complexity. So as indicated, this is the fourth of 5 class sessions in this Masterclass series. Just to remind you that we'll be back at it again on Tuesday of next week, where we look at fully automated warehouses. And all of our class sessions are available on demand in case you miss any of our sessions. And I'll just point out that our previous Masterclass series are also fully available on demand. And each of these topics, addressing labor challenges and cold storage trends, we had 5 30-minute class sessions. And you can go out and access any of those class sessions if you want to review them again or take a look for the first time. So with that understanding, let's go over some housekeeping items. All of your phone lines are muted out there. As indicated, we do record the class sessions, and those are available within 48 hours at the conclusion of each session. And we welcome you to be involved in today's discussion. If you're reaching us live, please submit your questions at any time via the questions tab in your GoToWebinar menu. And we're going to reserve some time at the end of our 30-minute session here for Jon to tackle your questions. Just like to again, let people know that we've got a very timely white paper available in the handout section. Today's white paper is titled A Skewed View of the Future, the Impacts of SKU Proliferation on the Entire Supply Chain and How the Tide is Starting to Change. So maybe a hopeful message there for all of us in supply chain. We know that SKU proliferation is one of those complexities that we routinely manage. Hey, let's take a look at the answers to our poll question today. The question again was, what unique selling channels do you operate in? And you had the opportunity to indicate multiple channels, as many of you do operate across multiple channels. And we see that 46% of you are selling direct via e-commerce. 31% are relying on brick and mortar retail, traditional channel of distribution. And then evenly 8% across the board, whether you're relying on e-com for via a third party, mass merchants and big box, or third party vendors ship direct. So again, about half of you are taking this on your shoulders yourselves via e-com direct. And I think again, today's session is going to be incredibly insightful for you as you look at the evolving role of your WMS system, from one that's there to serve within the 4 walls of distribution, to be the brains of that operation, to being the hub, in fact, for your IT configuration. So with that, let's go ahead and get into today's topic. And I'm just going to provide a few slides to set Jon up for his conversation with you. And we've all seen graphs like this one that indicate the market growth in global retail sales. And here we're looking at some data as we look at previous years, 2015 through 2019. 2020 is obviously an estimate, and what we know about that estimate is it is going to be very wrong. E-commerce has picked up dramatically as a result of the COVID pandemic, and we know that this graph is going to be wrong, and probably even in the years beyond 2020, as we look at 21 through 23, we can expect the growth to probably be much more robust than what this smooth line would seem to suggest of continued year-over-year growth. There's going to be a stair-step function when all is said and done for 2020 and perhaps beyond. Just to add a little more color, if you will, to that commentary, and by the way, I had to recreate this table. I really miss my student assistant in times like this. But thanks to the folks at McKinsey and Company, they're out there collecting data of very timely nature, and they ask their consumer panel around the world. This is quite recent data collected in late June, so just about about a month back, I suppose, and it was reported about 2 weeks ago, what their consumers panel expected to spend per category over the next 2 weeks compared to usual. And the color scheme key is found there at the bottom. You want to be shades of blue to indicate growth. The darker the shade of blue, the more growth we're seeing. And as expected, groceries around the world are seeing robust activity. And if I just focus on the US for a moment, in that leftmost column there, you do see growth also in household supplies and home entertainment. Other areas are showing various shades of orange or brown, which are showing decline. Again, you see several nations depicted here, and there are different pockets of growth appearing. I am kind of intrigued with India and China that are showing a particularly robust growth, and a good bit also in Korea and a few different product categories. But in much of the world, we're seeing not so optimistic viewpoints of consumers about their spending, save for a few areas. However, they ask a follow-on question that is depicted in the next slide, and you're going to see a big contrast, a lot more brightness, a lot more blue. When they ask what they expected, what consumers expected to spend online. And here, if you look at the US, from moderate to considerable growth across multiple areas, and even some fairly dark shades of blue there in the 30 to 49% category for groceries, alcohol. I have to admit I've probably helped them there. Household supplies, personal care, furnishings, but by and large, a lot more commerce happening online. And Jon, this is where I'm going to hand things over to you, because what companies throughout the supply chain are experiencing is a massive migration, a pivot from a lot of conventional channels in light of this crisis. And I'm hearing a lot of people, consumers now, that are buying for the first time online, things that they've never before considered buying online. And so in the supply chain, we're having to pivot to accommodate unprecedented and unanticipated growth through that online channel. So Jon, why don't we turn it over to you so that you can help us understand how the technology today, and perhaps warehouse management systems and the evolving role of WMS, can help us to cater to these changing trends.
Great, thanks, Tom. Well, that previous slide definitely is indicative of what I'm seeing the spend happen in my house, for sure. So, yeah, it's definitely a new world. When presenting with the topic here of production to last mile, WMS as the integration point, I had to kind of step back and try to come up with a good way to relay what I'm seeing in the market today, what I'm seeing from a trend perspective, And then I thought that perhaps the best way to drive it home is to speak specifically from the context of the work that we've done on behalf of one of our large customers and the growth that they've had in this area and some of the decisions that they've made that have worked to their benefit, and hopefully that can work to your benefit as well. So you know, we all know the old adage of make it, sell it, distribute it, and deliver it. It seems relatively simple, but you know, in this increasingly multi-channel world that we operate in, you know, being able to have accurate forecasts when there's so much variability is difficult. You know, who would have guessed that we would have changed our channel selling strategy so significantly over the course of the last 4 months? Selling across those channels, being able to scale up your web presence and scale down other aspects of your business as there's less demand. Distribution, way more complexities in terms of distribution and being able to allocate inventory across channels. And then delivery, we all have pretty high expectations today in terms of last mile delivery. I know personally that I've been disappointed by some of the performance of some of the online providers that previously have been able to, you know, quite easily get me in 2 days. I'm oftentimes 2 weeks. So the variability that takes place in a multi-channel world is exacerbated by, you know, some of these things that disrupt the overall supply chain, such as the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. And how I try to frame this up is from a traditional integration perspective, WMS has not always been leading up to, you know, quite recently, the center or the hub of the supply chain. Your typical integration model is that the ERP sits at the middle of your business systems infrastructure. And the ERP is going to be responsible for your available promise to your customers, it's going to be available for your master data, is going to produce execution data to send to the WMS to go do its job and then communicate, you know, debits and credits back against that ATP. And generally speaking, what we see is the transportation application is also directly connected to the ERP solution. And you know, it's sharing information, ERP information is flowing into the transportation application so that they can make good decisions on creating routes and making modal decisions for customers. And you know, the transportation system communicates that back to the ERP. And once again, the ERP sits at the center of everything. And specifically to situations where you're dealing with manufacturing, because there's oftentimes financial implications with ASNs, the ASNs oftentimes come from the manufacturing facilities through the ERP down to the WMS for execution. This is what I would say is, I'm not going to call it the traditional model, but it has been the model that we have seen most pervasive leading up to the last few years. If you go to the next slide, we're seeing a trend towards the WMS becoming the center of the supply chain. You know, ERP is still very relevant. You still have to have master data. You still have to have, you know, the ERP being the source of your executable data in the form of sales orders, purchase orders, really anything that supports your procure to pay and order to cash cycle. That needs to be the repository where all that lands. But the WMS, because it has, just by the nature of it, is inherently more nimble than your typical ERP solution. And by you know, managing a lot of the variability that we see in the market, that flexibility extends out by more logically inside of a WMS solution. So we see, what I'm seeing the trend is that the WMS sits once again integrated with the ERP solution, but the WMS takes ownership of the relationship with the transportation side and also takes a direct relationship with the manufacturing side, and that as product is being produced, whether it's in the same facility as distribution or an offsite facility, that direct ASN information is flowing into the WMS to reconcile the receipts. The WMS is interoperating with transportation. Transportation is making the multiple decisions and WMS is executing upon it. But there's a much more chatty integration there between transportation and WMS to be able to deal with some of the volatility and variability that takes place inside of the distribution center. The other benefit that comes along with this integration model is that once again, because the WMSs are more nimble, they're more easily configured to deal with the quote unquote other channels needs. And we're going to get into a little bit more specificity in some of these subsequent slides. So I thought the best way to kind of tell the story is to put it within the context of a customer that we've been doing business with for about 15 years. This particular customer started out as a mid-sized manufacturer selling in one channel, which was wholesale. Was successful in that selling channel, but over the course of time, new worlds opened up. They looked at the opportunities to expand into brick and mortar, opened up and created a net new e-com site where they were selling directly, selling their products directly. Also had the opportunity to sell their products through other selling channels, being third-party e-com sites. Spun up a pretty big business in terms of being able to resell their products through some of the big box mass merchants out there. And then also, because they wanted to try and sell in an endless aisle, they were attempting to sell, and still are selling, other people's products through their website via third-party vendorship direct. So they were at the luxury of owning their brand. And when you own your brand, gives you some flexibility to be able to sell where people are buying. So they were, I think to a certain extent, proactively looking into the future and trying to identify how they could make sure that their portfolio was going to cover all the different buying experiences that he or she may wish to open up their credit card for. The interesting thing about this is as they went through this journey, their supply chain execution did move into the hub or the center of their supply chain and became the backbone, and it became a much more complex. And that's kind of where we're going here in the next slide. So these new selling channels definitely added further complexity to moving the WMS to the center of their world. In that the warehouse management system then had interoperability to support all these other selling channels. So there's an OMS in play here as well that supported the ability to be able to do the third-party vendor direct in the endless aisle approach. But when you get down to the execution side and selling in all these different channels, the WMS had to have a lot of flexibility. So we had to continue supporting wholesale multimodal transportation, where we are sending single stop or multi-stop loads out to various wholesale clients. They spun up their own direct e-com site, which necessitated us turning on parcel capabilities and being able to execute small package deliveries. And then there was also a last mile component to their business in that some of their products required setup and in some cases customer delivery to home. So we needed a solution to be able to deliver to them, to be able to do white glove distribution with an endpoint being that yours and my address with a proof of delivery and a customer survey. So as these channels came to fruition and as we began to show success in these, we turned on a lot of incremental capabilities, but notice that those incremental capabilities were directly integrated with warehouse management system. They were not connecting with the ERP solution. Okay. Next slide, please. So this level of sophistication and the ability to sell across multiple channels really necessitated a lot of projects being spun up in a relatively short period of time. This client went from, as I mentioned, fundamentally selling in one big channel. You think of it in terms of putting products onto typically a truckload carrier that would be going out and delivering in a wholesale distribution model to that's day one, and in day 365, attempting to sell in fundamentally 4 new channels. So there were a lot of things that had to be spun up relatively quickly. The first decision that was a good decision was to also introduce a distributor order management system into the mix. That helped in the shared inventory model across selling channels, so that as ATP is being committed, as those orders were coming in from multiple channels, you had the ability to quickly make a decision in terms of where to commit that inventory from that would cost the least amount of money to the organization, and make sure that we were sharing that inventory all across all the selling channels. One unique aspect of this business is that there were constraints built into this model that distribution and transportation could only service so many orders of various selling channels within a particular time horizon, so that the distributor order management system had to take that constraint-based ATP commitment into consideration, so that in situations where you typically would have an expectation of being able to get a second-day delivery on an e-com order, they examined their capacity to actually deliver on the promise and would say that, well, we will get it to you in 4 days, but it will consistently be there in 4 days. So I think that's good steward of their capabilities. But then when you get down into the, I'll call it the execution side of it, where the warehouse management had to flex, there were a lot of projects spun up. Think of it from the perspective is, this distribution center was catching all of their inbound materials from their own manufacturing, so it was a very simple ASN-based receipt. Now we've opened it up, and now we have to be able to accept receipts coming from a very diverse supply base. So definitely necessitated some changes to their receiving capabilities. Being able to sell cross-channel also necessitates that you have completely different picking and replenishment strategies inside of these facilities. Plus, you're onboarding additional cross-channel selling products and in units of measure that were somewhat unfamiliar. This was an organization that didn't very often sell in interpacks or eaches, so dynamically different world in terms of net new products, as well as different units of measure inside of the distribution center, which obviously required changes to the physical layout. Because you're dealing with those different units of measure, things such as cartonization become relevant, where you're pre-assigning item quantities into the right box sizes to mitigate transportation spend. Value-added services that come into play because you're selling in these different channels. Returns and repairs. This organization also had the unique opportunity, because they had their own fleet, to leverage zone skipping in support of their e-commerce business, because they could line haul on their own trucks to the associated hubs for the parcel providers, thereby saving themselves tons of money skipping zones across the country. New slotting rules take into consideration velocity by like selling products. So the idea here is that there was a forecast in terms of how things were planned to sell across selling channels, and we would take that forecast and pull it into the slotting algorithms and try to fundamentally pre-planogram the facilities based upon how they plan to sell out, which was a very unique approach. Plus, think about all the associated integration points. They introduced some new levels of automation, new levels of parcel rating and execution, had to plug in a last mile proof of delivery solution, as well as a multimodal TMS solution to be able to maximize the efficiency in their wholesale business. So certainly moving the WMS to the hub when you get into a multi-channel, omni-channel selling environment is important. It's important to also have a supporting order management system that makes good decisions above it. But having that flexibility inside the WMS to be able to quickly react to these types of projects and get them done in an efficient manner, so you can get to a point where your value is being returned quickly, was key to this client. Next slide, please. So the result of this is that this customer approach really did set them up for success during this pandemic that we find ourselves in. Their flexibility has been the key to their success. We all know that, and looking back at Tom's slides, wholesale brick and mortar channels are creating top line gaps for organizations. People aren't going to stores right now. But in this particular case, the preparatory work that this organization did in terms of being able to support multiple channels, including e-com and third-party direct channels, covers that gap. And because of that, this customer has been widely successful in the new normal. And when I stepped back and I looked at the approach that this organization took to make sure that they were fundamentally covering themselves, it's very similar to the approach that you would take to your personal investing. You want to make sure that you're spreading your dollars across a broad selling portfolio. Do your research on the products that'll sell in what channels and can do so profitably, which is being a good steward of everybody's money. Enable the execution system to be able to support multiple selling channels. That's kind of redundant to what I was speaking to. Is this organization went from selling in 1 to virtually selling in 5 to 6 new channels. And then, keep your WMS and OMS at the center of that hub to manage the variability that you're going to experience. We're dealing with very unique situations here where new selling channels have come on board, and then put that within the context of COVID. That's almost unpredictable, and being able to manage that variability is much easier when you put the WMS at the hub rather than other alternative solutions. So with that, I believe that that's the last slide from a content perspective.
Right. Thank you very much, Jon. Hey, that case.